difficult for me to separate the personal from that corporate perspective, because a lot of what moves me in the work that I do with companies is because of my personal story. And so when I look at whether or not companies address mental health and well-being and how good of a job do they do, I look at it oftentimes from a multicultural competency standpoint. And I've worked with healthcare companies that have mental health services for their employees, and they also have mental health services for the members, the beneficiaries, the insured. And one of the things that I've noticed that a lot of times they fall short from addressing things from a cultural competency perspective. I had someone who reached out to me and said, I need to get counseling for my family. I am a Muslim. I have 2 teenager sons. They were African American. There were 4 providers in the network. None of them were Muslims. They were all white males. She could not go out of network. And I said to her, tell them that you want to go out of network because they failed to build a culturally competent network. It is a provider network adequacy issue, and they need to allow you to go out of network. So even companies that are making an effort, and some of them are doing a great job making an effort, I'm finding that they are missing the mark because they are not addressing it from a cultural competency standpoint.
That's great. I'm going to go to, if it is, you're right, very hard to separate the personal from the corporate. But I've sort of found something very interesting where there are companies doing it really well, but I run up against a lot of times the employees having a fear of even talking about it or addressing it. And I will say to employees, do you know that this service is available? Like, do you know that there's a number you can call? Do you know that you have it in your benefits? Do you know that it's free? Do you know that you, no. And they just kind of sit there stone cold, like they don't want to admit it. And granted, I do a lot of work in hospitals and healthcare, and people that are healthcare providers, whether they're doctors or nurses or social workers or caregivers, and I will put myself in this category, are the worst, right? We are so used to taking care of other people, and what we do all the time is take care of other people. And so the concept of us taking care of ourselves is so foreign that even if a company offers all these great things, I am up always against the challenge of saying to these employees, it's okay. You're allowed to do this. Like, my favorite question to ask nurses is, what do you do for yourself? And I get the color of this table, white face. I have to ask it, and I'm not exaggerating, 3 times before they even register what it is that I am asking them. And then when they finally register, they go, yeah, no. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic of, there is definitely the fact that companies may not be fully addressing it, but also at times when corporate or hospitals or institutions are addressing it, the employees tend to be so fearful of people finding out that they may need an emotional well-being, or they may just need to have a conversation. They may need to just have a safe space, but they don't really know how to say, you know what, that's okay, I will accept that help.
So I guess along those lines, there are still obviously a lot of stigmas around mental health and well-being. And in your experience in working with different organizations and consulting, what are you seeing in organizations today that is both still reinforcing that stigma, but also things that companies are doing to break that down?
I think, so the hard part is that I think a lot of when you're trying to create a culture in a company, it does come from the top down, and so it is very much trying to get everyone to buy in that this is, one, a real thing that they need to address, and also understand that a lot of work stress comes from the organization and the people you're working with. And so a lot of it is, how are your supervisors managing these employees? Are you creating support systems in the workplace? Are you creating environments that are safe? And it's hard to talk to employers about that, because once again, they just want, okay, give me some steps, give me some resources, I can just throw that at people and not necessarily have to change an organization. But to have systemic well-being in an organization, that's really what needs to happen.
Yeah, I think overall there's still a lot of stigma around mental health, even within corporations. And when it comes, even when you look at the HIPAA laws that you're keeping people's health condition private, but when it comes to mental health issues, those are considered extremely private. And so it's another level of care that's given when you talk about mental health issues in terms of keeping it secret. So there is a tendency to encourage people to keep secret their mental health conditions. And also, as a number of our speakers talked about, is just the kind of the stigma, just even from a cultural standpoint. So when employees come into the work, they bring who they are with them. They don't leave it at the door, contrary to what may be expected, but you bring your culture with you into that environment. And within certain cultures, there is a lot of stigma around mental health issues. So you have them coming into the environment with the stigma, and then within the company, it's all kept hush hush. So there's not that open dialogue around, it's okay to have issues, it's okay to be depressed or unhappy.
So I'm gonna flip it a little bit. One of the things that I have found that is positive is when I give, or I've seen other HR departments give employee practical tools. So a little bit of what you were saying, like your classic type A personalities or overachievers, when you give them a toolbox or practical list, like this is what you can, then all of a sudden it's like their aha moment. Like, okay, I can take control of this. I can handle it, right? And so I think a lot of times HRs give all these lovely, beautiful, amazing benefits, and they're all floating up there, but people don't know how to bring them down to what people make fun of me for this expression, boots on the ground. Like, what's the practical tool? What can I do today? How can I execute this for me? How does this work for me? And I think I've watched employees have a really positive reaction and start to lose the stigma or start to lose the thought process when they feel like, I can control this because here's the toolbox I can create for myself. Or here are a list, even if it's as simple as I've seen health coaches give people a piece of paper and say, okay, on this paper is a list of your resources. And then they may not even talk about it. They just kind of walk away going, okay, I can now grasp something. I have a physical paper and I can go through a list and understand. So I think that could be a positive way to kind of go against the stigma or the maybe not being ready to talk about it, but understanding that they can formulate a plan.
I will bifurcate because I think there are two big themes here. One is, what you guys have just talked about is that this is not just in a box or of mental health, it's around leadership. It's how are companies dealing with it, how are they addressing it, how are they integrating it, how are they providing leaders and employees with the tools to actually address it, both in the office and out of the office, where we still have a ways to go. But then again, companies are starting to do things. So I'd love to pick up on that last piece, which will kind of close out our session, which is, what is the one thing that you think companies can be doing today to better address health and wellness in the workplace?
This is hard for me. As someone who is working with wellness companies, the thing we're always trying to do is get engagement, right? So there was a recent Virgin Pulse study that came out that's like 63 of their employers offer mental well-being solutions to their employees. 16% of their employees utilize it. No one uses the services out there. So what can companies do to connect employees to services and make a something that is sustainable there that is helpful for people? And I do think a lot of it is just bombarding employees multiple ways in that it is okay. So it is everything from passively putting up posters to management talking about it. I think there's a lot of really good opinion pieces out there about how if your C-level is vulnerable and is telling their stories, then the employee is much more comfortable reaching out to those resources because it becomes normalized. So that is kind of one of it.
I think one of the things that companies can do is really start to examine their internal policies. That looking at what policies that they have and reviewing those policies and saying, at a policy level, how can we begin to make a change? I do work around end of life and in wellness, and in some of my presentations, I just talk about that grieving process and how the way the bereavement policies are set up in this country does not even allow for people to grieve. Most people get 3 days if it's a close family member. And for a lot of customs and traditions, you haven't even had the funeral yet. So you get the word, you have to go back to work because you need to save those 3 days for the funeral. And just even looking at that leave policy and whether that creates a healthy environment when you force people back to work when they're still grieving.
So I'm gonna kind of bring it a little bit together. In terms of leadership and policy, some of the things that I've witnessed recently is twofold. One is leaders actually motivating with their teams and forming programming with their teams. So they do team building experiences and experiential things where the leader leads it, encourages the team to go with them and participate, and then the team feels like, wow, if he or she can do it, I can do it too, and then it generates a conversation and communication amongst the team. And then the other thing I heard recently, which was great, is that a leader gives their team or their employees permission. So I was teaching a class and this gentleman said to me, I'm sorry I was late, but I got here as early as I could, but I actually said to my boss on the phone, I need to cut this conference call short because I'm going to yoga. And his boss said, fantastic. And just the fact, in corporate New York, finance, corporate New York, a guy says to another guy, I need to get off this call to go to yoga in the middle of the day, not after work, 12:30 in the afternoon. So, but just the fact that that generates a communication, right? And that back to your policies and back to leadership. If the leader says it's a safe space, you can do this, I'm not gonna fire you if you do this, or I'm not gonna make you feel like you're not getting your work hours in and you're not clocking in. And then there's a policy in HR that HR is promoting people to do it. It kind of brings it all together.
Thank you all, and thank you, Min.
Good. Do we have any questions?
I do.
Yeah, great. Go
I
ahead.
have a question for you because having lived through many corporations where, you know, they would put the box out before the big meeting and it would say, ask your most personal questions you want to know. And you'd be like, everybody knew, don't ask the questions that you really want to ask. These are the wrong things. How do you see more trust between the employees today and the corporations? Or, because my whole experience was there were the, you know, like, don't believe them. Like, don't let them know, don't believe them. If you told HR anything, it was like telling, you know, like telling the world it went on a megaphone to your boss before you got back upstairs. So, has it changed?
As an HR person, I think there has been change. I think we have a long way to go, and I think what's happened, as much as things are important to change from a top-down perspective, I think what's happened the last 5 years as new generation has entered the workforce, there's been a huge upswell of the bottom up, also making change and demanding flexibility and openness and feedback and transparency and ability to kind of live their life before they live work. And I think that has also infused all the generations that are sitting under the same roof. So I do think there is a huge groundswell, but again, I think it's the beginning. You guys may have some other perspectives too.
I think it depends on the individual, because oftentimes people go into work environments, and sometimes it's because of gender, sometimes it may be because of religion, it may be because of race, where they can't be their authentic selves. And if you can't be your authentic self, you're not opening up to any boss, any HR person about what may truly be an issue to you, because you're going into that workplace trying to fit in. And that oftentimes means you're not gonna be open. And so I think in order to be able to have that openness, people really have to feel like the work environment itself is a safe space. And so companies that can create that, I think that there's more of that openness among all employees. In companies that can't, you will find that some employees will not open up. No matter what services you have available, they're not gonna open up.
But I do think it's changing quite a bit. We still have a long way to go, but at least for the work I do, and I can only say people hire me, and so it's changing. They're trying to change the culture of a company, so to a certain extent, but it is a huge battle. But it's definitely changed a lot, especially in a place like New York. Yeah.
Do that too. What is the best practice in terms of communication about mental health conditions in the workplace? You know, I own a business, and I get hives when people communicate about their own conditions or diagnoses in meetings, going, like, the more information that gets shared in a work context where it is private, HIPAA oriented, you know, HR will call the person who said, oh, you know, so-and-so is managing through a depression. You can't share that, right? You can't label it, you can't communicate it. I mean, that's all of my training being brought to this conversation. I'm like, what is the proper discourse around what are medical conditions which are highly personalized, right? Highly private. You may choose to share in one conversation. If someone moves from that conversation and describes you with a category, like, to me, I'm like, lawsuit city. Like, how do I protect you? What is the best practice? Because I'm frightened of managing the opening up of, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about it. I just don't know that it should be in my work environment.
Right, well, Linda, I know you're the law expert, so I'm gonna throw that.
Well, what I will say is that people need to be trained. You don't throw them into situations without training. So, and that's not hey, what's the best practice? That's what kind of training do you receive in order for you to be able to manage those conversations? And I think training is really key, and oftentimes the right amount of training is not put in place. So even when you tell someone you have to keep something private, if they don't understand what privacy is, that doesn't mean anything. Because you can say keep it private and then it's left on the desk. Or when you say keep it private, I didn't know you meant that I couldn't tell so-and-so. I thought you meant I couldn't tell everyone. Or I tell Yo Ming, and I don't say, hey, let me tell you how to keep it confidential. So the training is, I think training is really key, that you have to have the right amount of training. If you want to ask people to open up, then you have to train the people who they're opening up to.
I just want to share a couple things. Just a good friend of mine is one of the wellness directors at Google, and they did an amazing job, particularly around mental health. One of the things that they decided to do, specifically around this question, we know we've got stressed out people. They aren't going to talk to their supervisor. They're not going to talk to HR. We know that. And so they trained people throughout their organization, HIPAA compliant. What does this really mean? What are our tools and resources? They taught them real listening skills, like what you get when you go into a coaching session. And so they graduated from this, and they had a mentor to do this, and they all put a blue dot on their ID as they walked around, so that everybody, and then they talked about this. If you have an issue, you can go to any of these people. So that's a very practical example. I can tell you that Zappos, also, I've heard them talk about this when they changed their culture. I talked to their benefits manager, and they thought this was going to be the greatest thing, like, whoa, everybody's going to love this and embrace this. Yeah, anybody who's been through major change in an organization knows no matter how good it might be, people hate change. It scares them. And so they did a tremendous job of a whole campaign that was funny, that worked for their culture. You don't have to grin and bear it. And cute, fun, they kind of destigmatized the whole thing, is that, you know, it's serious, let's talk about it, but hey, we screwed up here. We get it, you know, so we're all in this together, we're gonna do this. So there are many examples of organizations that are starting to look at this in different ways. I do think it needs to be culturally specific. I don't think there is ever one size fits all, but those are just two examples that I've seen out there that have been very successful.
I just want to add one thing. So my instructors and the work that we do, people come and tell us everything all the time.
Yeah.
And what I say to my instructors is, here's your resource. Please say this to the employee. There is a health coach, there is an EPA, there is a benefits department, there is an HR. Do not engage in that conversation, because that is not your responsibility. But here is the resource, and this is where you, so it goes back to your training. I'm very specific about that training, because again, when you're doing the kind of work we do, people do open up and say things, and then there's a huge thing. I have a mother who's an attorney, so yes, there is a big thing of libel and being sued. So back to Mim's point, or your point, it's that you have to train people and say, again, here are the resources, and these are the people to talk to.
And I just want to add one other thing too. Just not even just the fear of being sued, but just even the fear that you may have put that employee in a difficult position in terms of their job. So they may not sue you, but a lot of times people, because of the stigma, a lot of times it may interfere in their promotion. What kind of responsibilities people give them. Well, I'm not so sure if I should give her all of this to do, because I understand she's not that stable. And so it's also not just looking at the lawsuit side, but is it in the best interest of the employee when maybe their supervisor knows something that may then restrict their growth opportunities in the company.
Absolutely.
Yeah.